So this is we're gonna do a little bit of a reaction to this subject matter because it's a big discussion that's been going on for the last couple weeks. Are we in a video game crash right now? Because of all the layoffs that have been going on right now in the world with tech, big tech, as well as the video game industry itself. Major publishing studios, major development studios are laying off at mass numbers, like huge numbers, hundreds. And it's got a lot of people kind of running scared right now about the industry. The health of the industry, the stability of the industry, the creativity of the industry, all these things are in question right now. And I think that it's a great time to discuss whether or not we are in that phase right now. Many people would say we are. I'm definitely in that category where I would agree, given the circumstance. Being all fucking wild right now. But actually, it's not really a but let's kind of see where this conversation goes. This is a video done by RGT85, who is a pretty prolific content creator on YouTube. He's got 500,000 people that are subscribed to him. He makes view counts in the hundreds of thousands, and he mostly covers topics about the gaming industry. He's kind of a gaming news channel. I don't watch him consistently, but every once in a while he dives into subject matter that I'm interested in and talks about the news that I'm interested in. I wouldn't say I regularly consume his content, but I thought that when I watched this the first time, this was an interesting subject matter, and I kind of stopped it halfway through and thought, okay, let's watch the rest of it later because this is an interesting topic. So I'm curious to see what the rest of his response would be about this topic, but let's go ahead and watch it real quick and see where it goes.
I am marking this official, folks. We are in the great video game crash of 2024, and things are going to get worse before I feel that they get better. Now, I have a lot of things to say on
no doubt about that.
But before we get really too deep into it, we have to talk about the last video game crash that we saw in history, because that's where many people's minds are going to go, and they're going to compare and contrast 1983 to 2024. Now, the video game crash of 1983, I feel, has been, well, misconstrued by history, because yes, in America, there was a video game crash. Retailers didn't want to sell video games anymore because of the stigma attached to them, but that was a very regional thing. You see, at that point in time, video games wasn't really like a huge worldwide phenomenon. There was primarily 3 different regions where video games were either created or enjoyed. There was America, but there was also the UK and Japan. Now, in 1983, the UK did not have a crash. They had their little weird computer things, Commodores and stuff like that. Stuff I never really played, but they weren't impacted by it. Japan obviously wasn't impacted by it because the Famicom came out in 1983 there, which you know now as the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was released in 1985, years after the crash, and it wasn't positioned as a video game console in North America. It was positioned as an entertainment system to sort of.
This is all shit way before my time. I grew up with video games in the Sega Genesis era. That was when I grew up. Super Nintendo kind of was a little bit before my time, before I was walking effectively. I remember the first game I ever saw was on the Super Nintendo, which was Star Fox at the time. And then obviously Mario after that. But my first real experience with video games, like my first personal experience with a real video game, was the Sega Genesis area of Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Sonic, and what was the other game that was off the Sega Genesis? Streets of Rage. Those were the 3 games that I was most keenly familiar with during my early years, because I grew up playing video games in the early 90s. That was my first experience with video games. And so this is all shit before my time. And I'm an old-ass motherfucker at this point. But, you know, growing up in the 90s, playing a lot of games, I always heard people talk about the 80s crash of video games, and I had no idea what the fuck they were talking about. To me, it always seemed like that was like the early stages of game development and game history where you really couldn't have a crash. It was more like, you know, you could effectively just you're at the infancy of the you're at the infancy of an industry, so it's kind of hard to identify it as a crash. But this is all a history that I'm not familiar with. But that was what was just going through my mind at that time. You know, not really at that time, but for the longest time, that was how I always kind of like thought about that.
Right the wrongs of the video game industry, but I feel like there are some parallels happening with the video game crash of 2024 and that of 1983. Now, obviously, gaming has become an entirely different beast than it was during those times. It's a lot bigger. There's more money, there's more suits, there's more executives, there's bigger productions, and most importantly, you have this worldwide reach where people in other regions that usually weren't playing video games in the mid 80s unless there was some sort of importing that they did are now able to enjoy the same video games that everyone does pretty much everywhere. Now,
and that is definitely the case. I also think there's a different culture back then. Like back in the 80s and 90s, I remember growing up as a kid, there was such a negative stigma towards playing video games, especially during like the PlayStation 1 era and the Nintendo 64 era. It was really frowned upon by not just adults, but even kids growing up. As much as kids loved playing those games, there was a negative association with it. It was almost like, you know, the 80s version of the Dungeons and Dragons kind of era where like there's a bit of a scare with video games to a certain degree, and people were really overblowing the fear tactics of like the gaming industry and video games themselves. This is before like, you know, video game violence kind of dealio. This is even before then. There was definitely a stigma attached to gaming, and I think that has largely gone away now. People do not look at video games with such a negative stigma, and they view it as a cultural thing now. And the culture around it has definitely changed worldwide, but more importantly, here in the West, I think that a lot of people not only view video games as something that is positive, but something that can build communities and powerful communities at that, really resilient communities. There's a lot of growth that that video games themselves have seen, not just in this last decade, but the decades that came before within the last 30 years. Especially when we go back to the 90s. Because the 90s era, like between 95 and 2000, that 5 years, there were some classic titles that defied like expectations and redefined video games as we know them today. Games like Final Fantasy, games like Metal Gear Solid, games like what are some other major games? Resident Evil, Silent Hill, cultural games that we know today that redefine what we understand about video games around the world. Obviously, you got like titles that came before that, like Mario and Zelda and all these other games that came before them that also redefine cultures. But that era of the PlayStation, I wouldn't say it's like bigger than Nintendo. Of course it's not. You know, Nintendo was huge long before they came around. But that era brought us into a new art form of video games itself. It like showed that video games can become a art form. That was that first major step that we started seeing beautiful cinematography, beautiful storytelling, like these wide-reaching things that went beyond just kind of childish, like childish storytelling or like very simplistic storytelling to like cinematography, you know, early steps of that direction, psychology and things like that.
Now, obviously, there are some restrictions with that, but for the most part, you know, for the most part, you can access video games no matter where you live. But we are seeing some huge things happening in 2024. And like I said, I don't think this is going to get any better. I think it's just going to get worse. And you're going to see more and more of this. First and foremost, let's talk about all the layoffs that we are seeing within the video game industry.
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is not an isolated thing. Bungie of all people, you know, they used to be the Halo people. They laid off a ton of people. Rocksteady Games has announced that they are laying off people today. It seems like every day you wake up, you're hearing about more layoffs in the video game industry. Hell, Visions of Mana's team, the game came out, and the same day the game came out, they laid off a bunch of people and are allegedly closing the studio that made that game. So
I did not know
why is
that.
this happening though? You see all
That's
these
wild.
reports about video games basically generating all of this revenue, so you would think that things would be better for the industry and that everything would be smooth sailing. Well, there's a myriad of reasons for that. First and foremost,
Question is
let's
why,
talk about
yeah.
corporate greed, because corporate greed is something that does indeed exist. You have these.
I think it's funny. I'm not trying to be mean here. I think it's funny that he phrased it like that it indeed exists, as if no one knows it exists. Everyone knows it exists. Well, you want to know how we know it exists? Because microtransactions exist. Everyone has known that for the last, 15 years, or not even 15, long before 15 years, even back in the 90s, there was plenty of corporate greed with re-releases that were extremely predatory. But we know within the last 15 years, with the increase of DLC practices and predatory microtransaction processes, and I think it was 20 years ago when they introduced pre-order bonuses and the controversies surrounding that greed has been implemented into the games industry because there was a clear distinction that it was going to become a multi-billion-dollar industry, and people with bad intentions start jumping in, or not, I wouldn't say bad intentions, the wrong intentions, because they want to make money more than actually make a beautiful game and a great game, and they are influencing the development process of it because they want to make money so badly that they're willing to compromise the integrity of the game as opposed to making a great product and then monetizing it in an appropriate consumer-friendly way. It's something that we've all known for a long time. So I think it's silly to say it in that way, but I don't think he means it in a bad way. I just think that it's silly that he's saying it that way.
Suits and these executives who, they don't care about video games. They might act like they do, but honestly, they really don't care. What do they care about? They care about making shareholders happy. So they try to hop onto the latest trends. They try to make games that they think are going to sell very well based on maybe other IPs and other video games that have come along. I feel like Concord is a perfect example of this. Concord exists in the size and scope that it does because of Herman Holst of Sony. Herman Holst of Sony played this game years ago and was like, wow, this game's awesome. This is gonna transform everything. So Sony went out of their way to acquire this studio. Sony went out of their way to pump this game up. I don't think this game was going to have a budget the size that it ended up having, but reports are coming out now that this budget
$500 million
for Concord was $250 million.
Oh, now we know it's $400 million.
$250 million for a basic hero shooter that doesn't do anything really outside of the norm, that doesn't have identifiable characters in terms of people that you would see and be like, oh, well, this is a hero shooter. These are our heroes. We're using, known entities and known IPs. No, there's none of that.
I don't like the, I think this is a little bit not nuanced a little bit, because there's a lot more to this conversation than just that. This game is, in its foundation, is I never played it, but I can tell by watching the damn gameplay. Fundamentally, this game is fine in terms of gameplay, but it doesn't stand out in the market that is incredibly oversaturated, along with its character designs that are not that appealing, but also gameplay wise, it is just a basic shooter. Yes, fundamentally, it's just a basic shooter. There's nothing wrong with having a basic foundation of a gameplay. You're just not going to make yourself stand out very much in a really oversaturated market. But the bigger component of it is that putting it on just one CEO, I think is a little, or not CEO, but one individual that has a lot to do with why things did fail. It's understandable why people at the executive side would think that this game would be a success. What is baffling is that they did a beta test and then got the physical evidence that this was not going to succeed, and they still pushed it out. That's baffling. that's when you know that something else is going on. It's more than just the factor that the game wasn't going to succeed. It was also a factor that they got the red flags ahead of time. They got iceberg ahead, watch out, and they still went through with it. That's a whole different issue. That's just not just a mismanagement side of things, but someone made a critical mistake and a critical decision failing that didn't just undermine this game itself, but it undermined their approach to selling this game and marketing this game. I don't think that this game was going to do well no matter what, because this game is not that special overall. But people saying it's a horse trash game, you haven't played really bad games before. And there are far worse games than Concord out there. But it's not an interesting game, and the market was never going to be receptive to it because people are not interested in this product right now. There are plenty of hero shooters between like Valorant and obviously like Overwatch may be imploding to a certain degree, but I don't know if it's making a recovery at this point in time. But that's still a hero shooter. And many of these hero shooters are free to play, while this is a $40 entry price point, which already hurts itself. There was just so many things that were going wrong. I don't think the game itself failed because it was a bad game. I think the game failed itself, or it failed as spectacularly as it did, because the investments that went into it were not properly allocated, and there was too much money put into this that didn't need to be put into it, and it wasn't properly like managed in a good way. It was horribly mismanaged and horribly marketed, and obviously, like, it being like a not free to play game just really hurt its chances, especially against such a competitive market. There were so many things that went wrong with it. So I think that putting it on one person is, I think, a little bit much. I'm sure that there are a lot of evidence that shows that he did have something to do with it, but it's not just him that's making that decision. There are plenty of people that were made the same bad decision ahead of time because they still pushed it out despite the beta failing. You know, there were so many roadblocks that led to that situation that it wasn't just one person that made the decision. There was a shit ton of people that made that decision by the time they released the game, you know?
This was a $250 million disaster. Suicide Squad, another live service game that nobody asked for. We're talking about Rocksteady here, a company that is known for excellent single-player games such as the Batman Arkham series. These are some of the greatest video games of all time. I don't care what anyone says. And I think that making these talented individuals, even though the original studio heads had left the company, maybe they saw the writing on the wall, to make Suicide Squad a game that completely failed, a game that had no player base at launch, a game that you looked at this game and you were like, no, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I wanted. And now we're seeing layoffs. Now we're seeing the failures of this game. Now, companies do have the luxury of writing things off, but what ends up happening is for every failure that we see, the video game companies adjust what they're doing, and they're looking at what went right and what went wrong. But a lot of times we don't learn from our mistakes, and that kind of leads me into really what I feel is the main point for this crash right now that we are going to see, and we're going to continue to see, are these ridiculous high budgets. Game studios are overinflating the budgets for these games. Games are costing so much more to make now than they did even 5 to 10 years ago. And when you're constantly trying to, chase trends and, find out what like the hottest thing is, like Concord is a product of Overwatch. Suicide Squad is the product of live service games that, 5 years ago or so, they were seen as, new and exciting things. They were seen as something that was different within the video game landscape. But even going back then, you still had failures. Think about games like Lawbreakers and stuff like that. Lawbreakers came and went in the middle of the night. Think of how many games with a strictly multiplayer focus that have, you know, maybe a low price of entry, or maybe they're even free, but rely on things like microtransactions and season passes to, you know, survive. Think of how many games are in that graveyard compared to the games that have succeeded. See, that's the thing. It's almost like a drug addict. You're constantly trying to, you know, get that new high. You're trying to reach that new plateau. You're trying to emulate what you're seeing other companies do instead of just focusing on what you want to do.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, which is the issue at hand is that a lot of game development is, I wouldn't say game development. A lot of these managers at these decisions are, well, okay. Why is everyone bringing up the money for why these things are failing? Why is people talking about why these games being so inflated being such a bad thing? Because a lot of people are like, well, if the game has more money invested into it, it should be a better product by the end of it, in theory. But here's the problem at hand. The more money that you invest into the game, the safer you have to play it. You don't get to be risky when you have that much money involved. When you have a more reasonable budget, you get to play around with the rules a little bit more, because there's a less chance that like things are gonna blow up and like end the studio from the amount of loss. Like, for example, let's say that the investment into a game is like $10 million. Then you have a game that's invested like $500 million. Well, you bet your ass that that company is going to be like, you need to make this succeed, and we're going to make sure that we watch over you every step of the way to make sure that you succeed. Otherwise, layoffs, bitch. But if you lose $10 million for these companies, that's no fucking big deal. That's why people are asking, reduce the budget for many of these games, because you're reducing the risk of these studios getting a massive backlash. But also they get to be more, they use their problem solving skills to be more creative, and they get to express themselves in more creative ways without feeling the weight of all that responsibility, $5 million being invested onto their back. And they're like, well, we can't do this, we can't do that, because there's so much money on the line. We have to make sure that this sells to as many people as possible, as opposed to selling the envisionment of what the game should be. That's the reason why games like Elden Ring did so damn well, because the game didn't compromise on its vision, because it knew what it wanted to be, and it didn't need such an exorbitant budget to see that ends through, despite it being probably a very expensive game. But it wasn't like, you know, it didn't break new ground in terms of technological advancement. It just relied on its vision and its idea and its core focus. So that's why people are asking for reduced budgets in these games. Reduce the risk, so that way the developers of the game have to use their problem solving skills and creative solving skills without feeling the weight of like, oh, this could end our studio if we make one mistake. You know, it allows them to be that way. Now, why do companies want to invest so heavily? They want a significant return on their investment. Like, if they make $10 million of their investment and they make $200 million of investment, it's not enough for them. They want $1 billion investment return. That's what they want. But that's an unreasonable expectation, and it's an exorbitant amount of money that isn't necessary. And that usually comes down from the higher echelons of the company, the management side that gets bonuses at the end of the year. They usually are the ones responsible for this shit, because they don't care about the actual integrity of the game. They're more interested in selling these fucking games and selling them at high profit margins while willing to compromise the vision of the game, or at least, you know, swindling a lot of people into buying their game. And then, you know, these people have buyer's remorse and they don't give a fuck then. That's a big problem with that. Well, you mentioned something else that I wanted to cover, which was, yes, games copying other trends that are like 5 years past. Like, for example, like a lot of like hero shooters were all over the goddamn place, and they got very popular within, 5 years ago, and they've become now like mainline games that have been long invested in. Now you got a new hero shooter that jumps into the arena really late. And when you jump in that late, well, guess what? Now the market is really oversaturated, and now a lot of people are going to be interested in it. And it becomes a problem. Obviously, like, there comes a point at where it's not a factor of whether or not your game is joining an oversaturated market. You need a distinction and an identity that separates you from other games. There's a reason why certain fighting games do really well, while other fighting games do okay, you know, or do really well. And a lot of that has to do with exposure, but a lot of fighting games can grow cohesively together despite them being competitors, and people will buy those fighting games because of the fact that each fighting game has a distinct, unique flavor to that. People will enjoy Mortal Kombat for very different reasons, because it is a violent and cinematic fighting game. You got Tekken, which is a 3D fighting game that makes it stand out just distinguishably. Street Fighter, which is an established IP that has been around for a very long time. Smash Brothers, even though Smash Brothers, you know, for a lot of fighting game players is not a fighting game, but we'll pull it in the same arena because a lot of fighting game tournaments include them, so we'll bring that in as well. And it does share a lot of like fundamental ideas that are very much like that. What are other fighting games I can think of? Fatal Fury, which will be jumping around the corner real soon, will probably do pretty well. Maybe not a AAA budget or like a huge internal investment the same way that the big three do with Tekken, you know, Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter do, but it'll probably do well. Many indie fighting games did very well. Skullgirls did very well. We see a lot of resurgence of older fighting games right now, and these are all like a pretty, you know, fighting game is not a heavily saturated market, but each fighting game discernibly makes them different from one another. Soul Calibur may be a 3D fighting game the same way that Tekken is, but it is not the same kind of 3D fighting. And that's what this game failed to do with when it competed with games like Overwatch and Valorant and many of the other competitors, is that it didn't distinguish itself at a wide enough level. Now, Lawbreakers really did make itself stand out. That's one of the more unique cases out there. And my understanding is the gameplay to that game was actually really good, and it was a beautiful game, but it missed its window, and it came at a bad time. That's more of a unique case compared to this. This one has Concord definitely has a more discernible reasons for why it failed compared to Lawbreakers. Lawbreakers was definitely like, whoa, that flop was not just, you know, joining an oversaturated market. It just seemed to miss out all the marks and just got a lot of bad luck. There's a lot of reasons for why Concord failed. Mismanagement, overinvestment, a price tag that definitely hurt it, not being a free-to-play game. A lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons. Bad character designs. That is not good to have in your games.
Are in that graveyard compared to the games that have succeeded. See, that's the thing. It's almost like a drug addict. You're constantly trying to, you know, get that new high. You're trying to reach that new plateau. You're trying to emulate what you're seeing other companies do instead of just focusing on what you want to do. You're seeing Xbox and a topsy-turvy. Are they a console manufacturer? Are they a video game publisher? Are they a video game developer? Are they a multi-platform studio? Am I supposed to play on Xbox? Am I supposed to play on my TV? Am I supposed to play my Xbox games on my PlayStation? And people think that this is a viable option for them, and I guess time will indeed tell, but I feel like it just feels very strange. And I know what you're saying to yourself. Well, how can there be a crash if Nintendo still exists? Because Nintendo's success has been unparalleled this generation. And you're right. However, you do have to factor in a couple different things, such as right place, right time.
Yeah,
the Nintendo
exactly.
Switch launched at an optimal time because there wasn't a myriad of handheld devices as we see now with all of these different companies making various handheld devices that will play your Steam games, and the Steam version of the game runs better than the Switch version of the game. Of course, the pandemic really helped out Nintendo because everyone and their mother bought a Nintendo Switch and
I don't think that the pandemic just helped it. It boosted it. It brought it to the stratosphere. People were looking for things to do when the pandemic occurred. That really was an awesome win for the fucking Nintendo Switch. So many people bought a Nintendo Switch during the pandemic, and the Switch really was a unique device for a long time. In many ways, it still is. Yeah, it's an inferior handheld device compared to that of like the Steam Deck, but the fact that it's a hybrid device that it can be docked and brought anywhere like that. Yeah, you could dock the Steam Deck too, but it's just not the same experience. You know, it's slightly different compared to the versatility of the Switch. It really does distinguish itself quite a bit. The Steam Deck really is its only real competitor.
Animal Crossing, because people were stuck at home. But that also factors into the sort of crash mentality I have right now, is a lot of these studios, a lot of these suits, you know, they saw the success of the video game industry during the pandemic, and for some reason it didn't click in their head that the reason that this success is happening is because people are stuck at home.
No, I don't agree with that. I think that these suits, I'm gonna call them, they saw the industry growing long before the pandemic. These guys were jumping in long before. It just conveniently happened that there was a massive shift during the pandemic, because when the pandemic occurred, there was a big shakeup with a lot of people working at home. So a lot of people either got laid off or they stopped working at home. And so there was a big shakeup in the way that people consumed media. And so, yes, there was a huge surge in video games, but it wasn't, it was a huge surge, but it wasn't enough to like peak these suits, quote unquote. These suits were peaked long before then, because the video game industry was a multi-billion-dollar industry long before this shit came around. And for a long time, there was a lot of like games that have been mismanaged and mishandled. Like a great example of this is like the Silent Hill series back in the PlayStation 2 era. That franchise sold incredibly well. However, a lot of suits, or a lot of executives that took over Konami at the time, wanted to shift the priorities of the game itself, and then this game ended up turning into a game that was unrecognizable. They were just pumping out the game, the Silent Hill games, that did not understand what made them special in the first place, because they knew that the IP would sell a lot, but they weren't so interested in selling a good product or hiring a development team that was genuinely understands what the product was. And so the game was beaten and battered by such an extreme extent that the game effectively went on, you know, hiatus for a while after how poorly they started selling. So there was a plenty of executives that saw where this industry was going long before the Xbox 360, long before the Xbox One or any of these other consoles that exist today, these new generation devices. It's just that today, a lot of those people that were in charge before are now in charge, they're now out, and now there's more greedy bastards that are in charge now. That's kind of what's happened.
They have nothing to do. You literally cannot leave your domicile. So of course you're going to look for some sort of entertainment. That's why retro gaming prices skyrocketed. That's why all these movie subscription services skyrocketed. But you have these dumbass executives who just think, oh, well, hey, this is going to last forever. Look at me. I wear a suit and tie. And
I don't legitimately think that any executive thought that this was going to last forever. No one in their right mind legitimately thought that the pandemic was going to last forever. What was naive was that they thought they could cash in before the time limit ran out, before people went back to work, before people started living their everyday lives, before they started running out of money, before all these components start happening. I think that these executives thought that, oh, this is the time to start doing more predatory things and people are going to accept it. And the unfortunate part is, it's kind of fucking true. It's kind of true. A lot of these layoffs are not because consumers are rejecting the game, even though some of that is the case. A lot of the times they are due to managers still selling well, like these games still selling well, and them still laying them off anyways because of mismanagement. And like we talked about, greed. It's a lot of that.
It's like, what the hell is wrong with you? How did you get this job? And I know that this hurts a lot of developers. And I know that, you know, these huge budgets cause things like layoffs, but you know, while there are really good developers out there and they're really just doing what they're told to by the higher ups, I feel like this hostility towards consumers that we see a lot of these developers have, like it's not exactly making for like a positive sphere here. If somebody,
I think that hostility that developers are facing is due to social media, because developers are communicating with consumers, and consumers don't like being told no. You know, as soon as they are told no or they're wrong, or something like that, you're going to get a public backlash and you're going to get a lot of hostility. And I think that that's been a bit of a shell shock for developers. And it's one of those things where there are times where the consumer is right. There's also times when the consumer is wrong. That is genuinely the case. Sometimes the customer is not right, because sometimes customers will ask for things to change and then they regret it later down the road when everyone understands that, oh, those weren't the right changes to make. And I'm talking about like updates and changes and stuff like that. There are, most of the time, you know, you should listen to your community and, or, you know, fit what you need to do. But you got to identify, is the community actually the majority, or is just a really quiet minority that is just drowning everyone else out because they're being obnoxious, you know? And that can expose them to extreme hostilities. More often than not, most consumers understand that it's usually not the developer's fault, that it's usually someone at the managerial side, the publishing side, that is in charge of these decisions, and they get pissy about that. The problem at hand is a lot of these developers use their social media accounts to reach out to their consumers, and guess what? They just became the new target, because now, like, oh, we actually get to vocalize with someone. Oh, these things aren't happening. What's wrong with you? Do something. And when there's probably things going on behind the scenes where they're like, we can't really do much, at least not for a little while.
if somebody doesn't like your game, like that's okay. You know, and yes, people will take it to extremes. People take my videos to extremes. There will be people in the comment section here probably saying terrible things about my beautiful mustache or me as a person or something like that. But I'm not going to entertain them and attack them over and over again, because all that's going to do is create yet another situation. All that's going to do is create more hostility. And yeah, it can be easier said than done to interact with every single troll. But like, these game developers just seem to like fall into these traps, like Brian 6767 42069 Blaze It on Twitter, you know, some random throwaway account that's clearly not a real person, but they're interacting with these people. I feel like this new generation of developers almost feels like they're owed something. You know, we made this game. This game should be successful. And it's like, no, this is a consumer driven industry.
I wouldn't accuse developers saying that they're owed something. I don't know what he is referencing here, but I would say that it's understandable why a developer would want their game to succeed. They're making a product and they want people to like their product. And yes, it's hard for them to not take it personally when they make a product and people reject it. It's understandable. There's a bit of themselves in that production process. They just got to learn not to take it so damn personally. But it's pretty hard not to do that. Like, even as a content creator, imagine when you make something out there and you put it out there and you put a lot of work into it and it doesn't work out. And you get like 10 views, or like, let's say you get like, you typically get 100,000 views, but you only got like 500. You're going to feel really demoralized, and it's hard not to take it personally, but it's something that you have to do. So yeah, it should be understandable. I don't think that these developers feel like they're owed something. I think that, yes, it is a consumer-driven market, but you also got to understand that people are going to feel a certain way when their product doesn't work out. It's just going to happen. They put hours into that product, and a part of themselves is in there. And so yeah, it's going to hurt them.
All of these video game companies exist to entertain people. And if they're not able to keep their budgets in line, and they're not able to release games in a satisfactory stage when these games do release, then maybe we need a crash. maybe we need a flushing of the video game industry and get back to its roots and get back to what it was all about.
I don't like
Nintendo
this.
has even said, with the
I
upcoming
genuinely don't like
generation,
this sentiment. I dislike the sentiment. I gotta be very frank. The reason why I dislike the sentiment is because if there is a video game crash or a flush, as he says it, do you think the executives are gonna get flushed out? Nah, not a chance. Do you want to know why? Billions of dollars were invested, hundreds of millions of dollars were invested into each of these executives, and their position is solid. The people that will suffer the most from these crashes are consumers and the developers that make the games. If you want a clean out of bad people, you need the management to get shuffled out. And how do you do that? Here's the thing, in my honest opinion, it's bad press. That's honestly the best way to do it. You find out who is mismanaging these things and you call them out for their responsibility in it. Bad press can do more damage than like a lot, like what people realize. Like it's when a shitstorm drops down on a company, it burns good faith with their consumers, and these companies know that, and so do these executives. We've seen industry leaders get forced out of their position because of bad decisions that they've made. For example, I forgot what the president of Unity was, but he made that really fucked up policy in which a lot of developers started backing out. Like, a lot of developers started like leaving mid-development cycle to stop working with the Unity engine and emailing because of all the bad press revolving around that president that made that policy. And I can't remember the exact policy off the top of my head, but it was like all these developers were getting like getting charged for using a free product, or not necessarily a free product, but they were getting charged like an extreme premium that was not there previously. Can't remember the exact details, but I do remember that specific Unity president ended up getting flushed out of the company because of that mistake. It was a huge mistake, and because of that, he was out. Bad PR can do more damage on the upper management side of things than people realize. So spreading the word on these people that are in charge of these things can go a lot farther. That said, you also got to treat that responsibility very carefully, because the wrong people can get caught in the crosshairs. For example, I remember there was the guy that got really wrongfully blamed for the failures of the second generation of Silent Hill games after Team Silent left. And I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was like he was like a producer of some kind, not an executive producer, but like a senior producer of some kind. And his name got dropped all over the goddamn place. And people were like, I think his name was like Tom something, but in any case, everyone blamed him for why Silent Hill was failing, but he wasn't a developer, and he sure as hell wasn't an executive. His decisions, basically, he was just there because he was the one that was willing to talk to the press. And because of that, people had a face to attack. So you do got to find out exactly who it is and find out, like, how deep is their involvement actually there. For example, there's no other way to put it. When we talk about like who's at fault for like why like Xbox has made a lot of massive fumbles, there's no one else to blame but Phil Spencer, because he's the one that signed the deal for Activision, and that blew up in their face. And now they had to do massive layoffs from critical development studios that they all recently acquired and lay them all off, which left them hanging out in the wind with no recourse no recourse out there. And they got completely blindsided by that because of their mismanagement with that whole acquisition. And so guess what? Someone that went even over Phil Spencer's head showed up and said, "We are taking over now." So you got to kind of know where to aim that PR cannon at, but that is the most effective way to really influence upper management, is get their names out there and criticize them. Criticizing is a very powerful tool. People underestimate its ability. There's a reason why everyone likes to talk online and when backlashes occur and negative press occurs around like an influential figure, whether it be an influencer or even a media outlet, it can be so like it can create this massive spiral of negativity around it, because it is a lot of people vocalizing these things, and guess what? That sentiment spreads. So it's very effective.
It was all about. Nintendo has even said, with the upcoming generation, expect games to take longer because of higher budgets and higher developmental time.
Yeah.
So if the Switch 2, you know, doesn't do quite as well as the Switch, could Nintendo see themselves in a situation like they obviously have a bunch of money? And I really feel like
they're never leaving the market.
I'm just kind of throwing something out there, because really,
I get what he's
when
saying.
you look at the video game crash of 1983, Nintendo was still fine because of Famicom, because of Japan, to bring everything back to its main point here. There are big differences, but I think we are in the end times, and I think you're going to see more studio closures, more layoffs, more games get canceled, more games that fail completely, and then studios are letting people go at an alarming rate. Really, like, the indie scene is kind of very important right now.
I'm going to be frank, though, about that, which is, I don't think, like, I'm not exactly sure what he means by, like, end times, but what I would say is that game development companies come and go. New development studios will be made, and they will be replaced. Unfortunately, what sucks is that there will be great talent that will be burned out of the industry, and those talents rob us of great video game opportunities and experiences that we could have had when those people decide to leave the industry because of how they were treated and how poor their experience had been. That is the real travesty of having things like this occur.
Because they're going to have to be that stopgap. They're going to have to be the companies with the smaller budgets. But then what ends up happening? An indie studio makes something interesting, and then the bigwigs come along, and they're like, hey, let me buy you, pal. And then they get bought out, and then they're in the same position. So, I don't know, man. I don't know. I really think something big is going to happen. I really think that something big is going to happen potentially very soon, because right now this video game ecosystem that we're in is not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
It's not. He's right about that. This is not a sustainable model. One way or another.
In order just to break even. It's not sustainable. It's not going to work. You're seeing the results of this mentality already in 2024, with studios closing, with massive layoffs, with studios shifting what they're doing, with games getting canceled, with studios shutting down the day the game releases. And I don't think that any company has Teflon armor to avoid this sort of thing. Things are going to get ugly, people. Things I really feel are going to get ugly, and we're already starting to see it. The proof is already there. It already exists. But people just want to turn a blind eye to it. And, you know, it'd be detrimental.
I don't think anyone's turning a blind eye. I think everyone sees what's going on.
Games. If I don't have video games to talk about, what am I going to do? I'll figure it out, man. I'll cover the crashes. I'll cover the madness that ensues after it. But I want to hear what you guys think about this. Am I being over dramatic?
I don't think he's being overdramatic. I think this is a reasonable feeling and a reasonable thought process to come to, and a good conversation to have. That said, I don't agree with many of his sentiments and viewpoints on these things, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But he's not alone. A lot of people feel this way. It's not just because I feel this way, or a lot of people that watch his shit feel that way. Everyone feels this to a certain extent, one way or another. Everyone's talking about the good old times. But here's the truth. We really haven't had, like, a perfect good old times unless you're talking about, like, the N64 era, when things were so fucking new that people were coming out with so many brand new ideas, because the video game industry itself was in such an infancy that it was genuinely brand new shit. Nowadays, a lot of games are fundamentally identical in some format or another, or they are doing similar things that other games have done because they are tried and true and they're reliable. Yeah, there are plenty of indie games that do something new and interesting, But fundamentally, every video game is somewhat similar in some format or another. And I think it's because, you know, we've kind of figured out like what works, what doesn't work, and what things that people generally like. So I think that it's one of those things where games are not as like, I think the game's solution, like the solution to video games for fixing the crash that we're having, is as simple as switching up management. Management is the primary culprit at hand. And people that are in charge of where money goes and how it's allocated, and whether or not the investments are the appropriate kind of investments. Like Suicide Squad was clearly gonna fail. You could tell by the fucking announcement that the moment that trailer was released, there was so much negative press. Yet the developers didn't double down. I mean, they already made their fucking game, but the upper management continued to double down. And not only that, but they gave them another year of development. And in my mind, when that happened, they robbed an extra year of development from Mortal Kombat 1, which did very well, but the game was so buggy and so busted on release that that game would have been better suited for another year of development to flush out what they needed and make the game a better product, as opposed to Suicide Squad just literally fumbled the ball even after that extra time. You know, Mortal Kombat still sold very well. So that investment was not properly allocated. It was not properly managed. If you gave the year of extra development time to Suicide Squad, in hindsight, I'm sure that the manager was thinking, I probably should have moved that extra year of development cycle to Mortal Kombat 1 and doubled down on that investment and got more out of that than a product that was just shit right off the bat, and identifying that as not a good investment. Still release it, sure, but don't invest another year of development just for the game to flop even more, because now you're just wasting money, you know? That's what I mean by like mismanagement. You know, that's what we're really struggling with, is that the wrong people are in charge, and because they're in charge and making the decisions, they're not making the decisions for what's best for the consumer. They're making the decisions what's best about making money, and that is not in line with what the consumer wants. The consumer needs to know that the things that they're buying is entertaining, and it brings them joy, and it brings them happiness. If you sell them a rotten product, it's going to affect your bottom line. So it goes. You don't think about, these managers are thinking about, oh, we just need to get their money. No, you need to give them happiness to get their money. That's how you get there. That's the trick. That's how you make money. Give happiness to your customers, and then they give you money in response. You don't just get their fucking money through scummy behavior. You may be able to pull it off every once in a while, but you want to know why games like Fortnite succeeded? Because it brought a lot of happiness to a lot of fucking people, despite the fact that I'm not a fan of that game. A lot of people did love it. A whole generation loved it. Then you can start microtransactioning them. Once they actually have their happiness, they'll be happy to pay you more. But don't play scummy behavior and rob them of happiness. That's the problem at hand.